On October 25th, 1854, the Earl of Cardigan, James Brudenell, acting under misunderstood orders, launched a suicidal cavalry charge against a Russian artillery position protected by heavily entrenched artillery guns. Although they managed to destroy the Russian battery, they took heavy casualties and the few survivors were forced to retreat. So what happened? Why did the Light Brigade launch an attack against a target they were ill-equipped to take? Let's find out. Hello and welcome to History's a Disaster. I'm your host Andrew, and tonight we're talking about the charge of the Light Brigade, a disastrous cavalry charge that is still talked about today and has become synonymous with the senseless waste of soldiers and highlights the importance of military intelligence and a clear chain of command and proper communication. The charge of the Light Brigade took place during the Crimean War that was fought from October 1853 to March 1856, and was started by Russian expansion towards Istanbul. Their stated claim was they were taking it upon themselves to be the protectors of Orthodox Christians. There had been a major fight between Catholic and Orthodox monks in a cathedral in Constantinople that they shared. The fight ended with the deaths of monks on both sides. Russia built up the Black Sea Fleet and was pushing toward Turkey and the Mediterranean Sea. The British and French entered the fight to protect a weaker nation from Russian aggression. At least that was their public intentions anyways. Away from the public, it was circulated the true intentions of the war on the Crimean Peninsula was the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet. If the fleet was allowed to reach the Mediterranean Sea, they would be able to disrupt British and French trade routes to India. And that, right there, is the main reason. The Russians were threatening British and French money, and they just couldn't have that. So the Black Sea Fleet had to go. So, now that we know a little about the reasons behind the war, let's meet some of the main players behind this little wartime drama. First up, we got Lord Fitzroy Somerset Raglin. Lord Raglin was the 65-year-old commander of the British Army in the Crimea. He had previously served on the staff of the Duke of Wellington and lost his right arm at Waterloo. Following this, he spent the next 30-something years doing administrative work in London and had no experience whatsoever being in command of anything, let alone an entire army. Next up, we have Captain Lewis Nolan. Captain Nolan was serving as the aide-de-camp to Richard Airy, the quartermaster general during the Crimean War and Raglin's second in command. Captain Nolan was a soldier's soldier. He lived and breathed the British Army. He quite literally wrote the book on cavalry tactics. In fact, it was published in London in 1853 and was called Cavalry, Its History and Tactics, and it earned him a reputation as an expert on cavalry units. Next we have George Bingham, the 3rd Earl of Lucan. Lucan? Something. This inept shithead was given overall command of the cavalry division in the Crimea. He was one of the most hated men in Britain. During the 1840s, when his Irish tenants couldn't pay their rent, he evicted them from his estate. Despite this happening during the Irish potato famine or the middle of winter, he sent out groups of men with crowbars to evict the poor farmers and to tear down the shacks they lived in so they couldn't sneak back on his property. Oftentimes tearing them down while the family was still inside. England was not pleased by this at all. Thousands of these poor farmers flooded England, and they all had to be taken care of, At England's expense, of course. He had previously given up command of the 17th Lancers in 1837 and had no sort of experience commanding men until his appointment of commander of the cavalry division. He was excited with the appointment until he found out the one person he hated more than anything would be given command of the Light Brigade, his brother-in-law, the Earl of Cardigan. Which brings us up to James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. While Lord Lucan was considered the most hated man in England, Lord Cardigan was giving him quite a run for that title. Which is fitting since they absolutely hated each other. Lord Lucan was married to his sister. Their mutual hatred of each other was widely known and had grown to legendary proportions. Lord Cardigan was mostly reviled by his treatment of men under his command. He was brutal and vindictive. One incident of this led to a duel in which he injured the other man and was arrested for participating in a duel. Dueling at the time was illegal in England and the punishment was death, or transportation. And I had to look that up. Transportation was a punishment used instead of the death sentence, and the accused were stripped of everything they owned and basically deported to some far-flung colony like Australia. Anyways, being a rich shithead, Lord Cardigan had no fear of either sentence and got off on a technicality. The British would show their displeasure with him anytime he was in public with boos and hisses. It was so bad that on at least 2 separate occasions, he was escorted from the theaters he was in so the audience would chill the fuck out and the stage performers could go on with the show. So how did these 2 shitheads become the heads of cavalry regiments? Well, they bought them. The English, in their infinite wisdom, decided they did not want a repeat of the French Revolution. So they put a system into place where officers had to buy their commissions, with each costing more and more than the last. This would ensure that only the aristocracy could afford higher ranks. Because, God forbid, the middle class, or even worse, the poors, reach a position of prominency in the army and possibly take control and turn on the nobles like the French did. So how much did a cavalry regiment cost in the 1850s? Well, you had to start as the lowliest officer, a cornet, which will set you back 840 pounds. Then you have to become a lieutenant, which will cost 1,190 pounds or possibly more. But fear not, because now that you're a lieutenant, you won't need that cornet commission, so you can sell it to another officer candidate, and get back your 840 pounds. Congratulations, now you can make captain at the low cost of 3,225 pounds. And if you made it this far, you're most likely not dependent on your pay from the army, so you can always go on half pay, which means you can do stuff like stay home and have nothing to do with whatever regiment you're in, other than claiming you're in it while you wait for a vacancy in a higher rank to purchase. Moving on up to the rank of major, and at a cost of only 4,575 pounds at least, and at this point you're definitely among only elite of men, the aristocracy. None of those lower class buffoons could possibly afford this rank. Doesn't matter if they have more experience or are more deserving of the rank. You have money. They don't, so who cares? And finally, at a cost of 6,170 pounds, you are now a lieutenant colonel, and with that, you now own your very own regiment. Congratulations, Colonel. And according to the converter I used, that comes out to over 500,000 pounds, or $620,000 in today's money. Think about how fucked we'd be if this was still a thing. The 82nd Airborne would be the 82nd Amazon. The Air Force would just be called X. The Navy would keep sinking every time they updated from all the glitches. The Marines would get outsourced to Mexico because it's cheaper. Okay, so one more quick thing before we get into the main story. Certain events leading up to the charge of the Light Brigade have caused a lot of speculation and conjecture amongst historians over the last 170 years since the charge. I'm going to be presenting the events as how I see them happening, putting my own personal bias into the narrative, and we'll dig into some of this afterwards. I don't want to be in the middle of the story and break it up with, well, this person thinks this, and this other person thinks that kind of bullshit. We'll get to that later. So with that, on with the show. On March 28, 1854, Britain declared war on Russia and assembled an army of 27,000 men consisting of infantry, artillery, and the 1,500 men of the cavalry division. The French would supply another 30,000 men, and the Turks would give 7,000. In April, it was decided the Light Brigade would make the journey from England to Turkey by boat, an open sea cruise of 3,400 miles. It was then decided they would travel by sail rather than on steamships. The journey would take at least 6 weeks by sail. Steam would have done it in half the time, which is quite a big deal when it comes to the horses. For some reason, horses don't like boats, or being locked up in small stables for weeks at a time, unable to lie down. Weird, right? Almost like they were living things and not machines. But on the bright side, the horses got to go on a swing when getting loaded on the boat. They got strapped into a harness and were lifted and swung onto the boats before being shoved into their tight quarters. So that's a plus, right? Why wouldn't they like being helpless as they got lifted into the air? And since these boats were small, it would take 5 of them to transport a single regiment of 300 men and horses. On the way there, showing that some things never change, a rumor started getting spread of a Russian superweapon, the boulette asphyxiante, a liquid gas fire that burned in the water, creating a gas that would suffocate anyone on the surface. But not to fear, because the English had their own fancy-dancy secret weapon. The Macintosh's portable buoyant wave repressor, which would instantly calm the waves and provide a smooth journey. And of course, neither of these things would appear. However, the brigade would get seriously fucked up far before they got to shore or even see a Russian. Almost 100 men had either died or been seriously injured before reaching Turkey, and 57 horses died along with several hundred horses, the thing that makes a cavalry unit, were considered unfit for duty. This caused a massive hit to morale as it hit an all-time low. The 17th Lancers and the 8th Hussars arrived in Constantinople on May 20th. Lords Lucan and Cardigan were there waiting to take them into their command. Lucan, being the absolute dipshit he is, was pissed and reprimanded the regiments on their appearance. The regiment set up camp outside Constantinople when Lord Cardigan deemed it fit to join them. He skipped the sea journey and traveled overland so he could bring his servants and extra baggage, which included 2 tents, one to sleep in and one to eat in, and a bed. Most of the regiment's horses would be deemed unfit for the duties of the Light Brigade, like recon and patrol. Captain Lewis Nolan, the aide-de-camp to General Airy, deemed the local Turkish horses unfit for duty and was sent by General Raglin to Syria to purchase proper mounts. After a week in Constantinople, the 8th Hussars were ordered to sail 160 miles north to Varna to support the Turks. The 17th Lancers would follow days later. Cardigan saw his opportunity to be away from Lucan and asked Raglin for permission to go with the regiments, completely bypassing the chain of command and skipping over Lucan. Raglin thought it was a good idea to separate the two men and agreed. Lucan was pissed, and no matter his reasons, the chain of command exists for a reason. It should not be fucked with, especially over some petty-ass rivalry or whatever between the two men. Also, because it let Cardigan believe he could act independently of Lucan. When the 8th Hussars made it to Varna, they were not able to actually dock the boats due to the quay being too shallow. So the horses had to be unloaded onto boats and towed to shore. To do this, they had to place boards across 2 rowboats and lower the horses onto this makeshift raft. The raft would then have to be towed to shore by other boats. Horses did not like this shit one bit. In fact, one would kick and bite a few men while they tried to get it to shore. The 17th Lancers would join them on June 4th, and by the time the 13th Light Dragoon arrived, a cavalry camp was set up outside the port. Left behind in Constantinople, Lucan would continue to bicker with Cardigan by letter. Attempting to exert his control from afar, he demanded that all brigade reports should be sent directly to him, which is the way it's supposed to be done. Not sent directly to Lord Raglin like Cardigan had already been doing. Lord Cardigan refused, believing since he was so far in advance of the main army that he should be considered a detached command and not fall under Lucan's authority. The cavalry would be left in Varna while a decision was made to invade Russian territory or not. Also, they would be in place to rapidly support the Turks in case they failed to stop the Russian advance that was moving towards them. The British and French infantry would soon arrive and join the cavalry in Varna. The now over 50,000-man army flooded the streets of Varna, which would cause the open drains to overflow as the temperatures rose. Dysentery would soon follow, and then cholera came knocking on the army's door. Then they all got a surprise. The Turks managed to push the Russians back without the assistance of the British. The army was left uncertain as to what would happen next as the weeks ticked by. However, as the summer temperatures began to soar, cholera started to run rampant in the closely packed army. As the death toll and temperatures rose, the Light Brigade was ordered to pack it up and move inland 19 miles to make a new camp at Devna. Back in Constantinople, Lord Lucan had finally been authorized to move to Varna. He was overly eager to catch up with the Light Brigade and put Lord Cardigan in his place. He was pissed to find out they were not there. He demanded to move on to catch up with them, but got denied. Lord Raglin refused on the grounds that the Heavy Brigade had not arrived yet, nor had the 4th Light Dragoons of the Light Brigade, and he should be there to meet them. Lucan was pissed again, feeling Cardigan was getting the better of him. Their feud was heating up quite nicely in the heat, but Raglin smartly kept them separated for now. The Light Brigade was settling into its new camp in Devna in an area the locals called Death Valley. According to locals, the area was infected with cholera, and after the first deaths began, they tried to get away from it and moved camp another 24 miles inland. They were now even further away from the army and almost to where the Turkish army was at in Silustria, just 7 miles from the Danube. The camp was set up in Yeni Bazaar, where the only shade to be found was at a small oasis. Lord Cardigan set up his tents here and forbade anyone from using the oasis, although it was big enough to supply the whole brigade with plenty of water. This would force the men to travel over a mile every day to get water for themselves and the horses. To make it worse, Cardigan was obsessive with maintaining cavalry regulations, having a hissy fit because tents weren't placed in a perfectly straight line. And then cholera came back. By August 12th, nearly a quarter of the 8th Hussars had been taken back to the hospital in Varna. No one expected to see them again. The men began to drink heavily and most laid around, too drunk to do anything. The latrines would overflow with not enough able-bodied men to dig new ones. Horses not quite recovered from the sea voyage started to die off. Morale was completely lost. Back in Varna, when Lord Lucan had any of the regiments with him, he would attempt to drill the men. However, it had been 17 years since he had any sort of command, and drill had changed much in that time. So much that no one knew what the fuck Lucan was saying when he issued an order. And instead of doing the smart thing and learning, he doubled down on his dumbassery and tried to teach the officers and men the old words of command. When the last of the Light Brigade regiment showed up, the 4th Light Dragoon, Lord Paget didn't appreciate this bullshit and was able to convince Lucan to learn the new commands. And, not to be outdone, Lord Cardigan would put on his own display of stupid. Lord Raglin, skeptical and unconvinced of the Turkish success, ordered Cardigan to take a patrol north to verify what the Russians were up to. Cardigan would take a force of 195 men from the 8th Hussars and the 13th Light Dragoons north out of Varna, with very little rations and no tents. And by no tents, I mean no tents for the men. He, of course, took his tent in bed. It took them 4 days to reach the Danube and see the Russians were gone. Mission accomplished. Time to head back to camp, right? Wrong. Instead of heading straight back to camp, Cardigan took a detour down the banks of the Danube. What should have taken 8 days would now take 17. And when he was overdue to return, Raglin had dispatched another patrol to find out what happened to them. This patrol would be back before Cardigan's. Everyone believed the patrol lost. And when they finally returned, the men and horses were exhausted and half-starved. 5 horses died on the return trek, and 75 were considered unfit for duty. The loss of so many horses basically canceled out the new horses Captain Nolan managed to bring back from Syria. The Light Brigade would still be seriously undermanned, or underhorsed in this case. Everyone saw Cardigan as incompetent after this. With the Russians pushed back across the Danube, the stated public goals of the army had been achieved. However, there's still the matter of the unpublished goal, the Black Sea Fleet. Then the official orders came in. Invade the Crimea. Take Sevastopol and destroy the Black Sea Fleet. And that nothing but insuperable impediments should be allowed to stop this. Although the army was reduced and weakened by disease, they had no maps of the Crimea or reliable estimates on Russian troop strength. Raglin felt he had no other option but to comply. So the order was given and the invasion was on. It would take until August 30th for everyone to return to Varna and prepare to sail to the Crimea. There was not enough ships for the entire cavalry, so the heavy brigade was left behind to wait for the ships to return while the Light Brigade went ahead with the invasion force. The Crimea lay 300 miles across the Black Sea, and the Russians would be expecting them. Despite this, the British and French did not expect more than token resistance, and Sevastopol would be theirs in a week or two. The British and French fleets would arrive in Calamita Bay on September 13th, 33 miles north of Sevastopol. Warships stood by with their guns ready to fire should the Russians show up while the invasion force was sent ashore. The infantry went ashore first, all under the watchful eyes of Russian observers in the hills. They made no attempt to interfere, just took notes of the incoming force. By the afternoon, a storm was raging and the cavalry was left stuck on the ships. The infantry would have to stay on the beach and hills near their landing site. They would have to spend the night without the mounted pickets that would warn them of an incoming attack. Fortunately, none came. Getting the cavalry was a slow process that would take 2 days to complete. The Light Brigade marched to the plains above the hills to make camp several miles inland ahead of the infantry and put up mounted pickets. They were put ashore with only 3 days of rations for the men and horses. They needed to find a supply of fresh water. Cornet Wombwell and his troop from the 17th Lancers had to make a 6-mile ride to find any. By nightfall, the rain began again. They searched for their tents amongst the supplies that were put ashore, but none were to be found. The Light Brigade would be forced to spend the night in the open plains during a storm. They were drenched and freezing by time morning came. Lord Cardigan would be ordered to take a force of 250 men to scout out and identify the strength and location of any enemy forces in the area. Second to this, he was to find freshwater sources, secure carts for transportation, and food for the men and horses. With the exception of a few carts, he would come back empty-handed. He found no enemies, water sources, or food in his 30-mile recon. Never mind the reports coming in of Russian Cossacks poisoning wells, or later patrols witnessing Cossacks setting fires to barns full of corn, or that other patrols were bringing in fresh food, including cattle and chickens. With sightings of the Russian Cossack patrols, tensions grew, especially amongst the inexperienced men, which would lead to at least one friendly fire incident when an infantry picket mistook members of the 11th Hussars for Russians and fired upon them. Fortunately, only one man was wounded, having been shot in the leg by an officer of his own regiment. The march to Sevastopol began on September 19th. Only 33 miles and 4 rivers separated them from the city. The Light Brigade, now down to less than 1,000 men, thanks to cholera and dysentery, were given the task of guarding the front, the left flank, and the rear of the army. The fleet would cover their right flank. The first day's march had to take them 10 miles to the Bulganak River, the next source of fresh water. 7 miles into the march, and infantrymen began to drop. Some had not recovered from the sea voyage. Others were getting hit with the first pains of cholera. The blazing noontime sun was also exacting a heavy toll on the men. Near 2 p.m., the river was sighted. The most desperate and thirsty men of the infantry ignored the orders of their sergeants and broke rank to run for the river. A Cossack patrol was sighted on a hill on the opposite bank. Lord Cardigan was sent forward with the front guard regiments. This patrol pulled back as they approached. Once Cardigan and his patrol gained the top of the hill, they saw the main body of Cossacks. 1,500 cavalrymen spread out over a mile in a valley behind the hills. Cardigan, with only 400 men, advanced on them, eager for a fight. The Cossacks were just as eager. One of the Cossacks, directly opposite the 11th Hussars, raised his carbine and fired, which the rest of his skirmish line took up and opened fire shortly after. The Light Brigade returned fire. Being at maximum range, This exchange of fire had little to no effect on either side. Lord Lucan had at this point joined the regiments on the hill and took command. Unknown to them, a large enemy force of 6,000 infantry with artillery support were hidden by the crest of hills behind the Cossacks. The Light Brigade would unknowingly wander into a Russian trap if they charged. By this time, Lord Raglin had gained the high ground off to the side of the Light Brigade regiments and spotted the trap. General Earls and Captain Nolan were quickly sent out to order the Light Brigade regiments to not attack and pull back. General Earls, as the quartermaster general, was in effect Raglin's second in command, so vastly outranked Lucan. They arrived barely in the nick of time to stop the charge. And since enemy cavalry had moved up and was ready to hit them in the flank, they had to sit and wait for more units to move up and support their withdrawal. While they waited, Russian artillery opened fire on them. As the incoming shells exploded near them, the 8th Hussars and 17th Lancers arrived to cover their retreat. One horse was killed in the enemy barrage and 2 men injured. The worst injury of this exchange was to the brigade's pride. They had withdrawn after an attack had been started, while they could deal with the Russians yelling as they fell back. The British infantry, who could not see the enemy force waiting in ambush, laughed at them, calling them silly peacock bastards. The Light Brigade had been humiliated. Everyone would nurse a grudge with the men above them. Lord Lucan, with Raglin, feeling that he had interfered with the authority of a divisional commander in the face of the enemy. Lord Cardigan felt that Lucan's arrival and assumption of command interfered with his authority as a brigade commander, and every regimental officer and cavalryman felt humiliated at being recalled from an attack that had already begun. An inglorious retreat replaced the charge they had anticipated. They all blamed Lucan for this. The next day, the army continued their push south with another 6 miles until they hit the second of the 4 rivers, the Alma. The Russians were waiting for them. On the southern shore of the Alma, they had entrenched positions 300 feet up the slope of a steep cliff. When the army got close, they opened fire. The Light Brigade was ordered to the left flank to protect against enemy cavalry trying to flank the army. Lord Raglin ordered the infantry to make a full frontal assault. This would require the infantry to march downhill, cross the river, then march back uphill to make the attack, all while taking heavy enemy fire. The Light Brigade would receive some incoming fire before moving out of range of the guns. Meanwhile, the infantry was coming into range of the Russian guns. As they marched shoulder to shoulder, they soon took deadly fire as the enemy round shot and explosive shells landed amongst the infantry. Gaps in their line would open up as the men fell. Soon, members of the Rifle Brigade came within range of the Russian musketeers, who came forward to stop them. Armed with the superior mini rifle, the Rifle Brigade was able to engage them from a much greater distance than the Russian muskets could match. Russian infantry fell dead and wounded, all of them confused and unsure how the British could be hitting them from such a distance. The British infantry pushed forwards towards the guns. Despite the high cost they paid to the Russian artillery, the British infantry took out the Russian guns that controlled the road to Sevastopol, while the French took control of the hills between the road and the coast. They had won the Battle of the Alma. Now, normally, when an enemy is forced to retreat like this, the cavalry is ordered in to pursue them to prevent from rallying and making a counterattack. An effective cavalry pursuit could often turn the enemy retreat into a rout. The Light Brigade waited eagerly with their weapons at the ready for the order to pursue as they watched the enemy flee. The order never came. Lord Raglin did not want to risk the cavalry by sending them out. A Russian cavalry force of 3,000 was known to be in the area, and Raglin didn't want to chance the understrength Light Brigade running into them. The cavalry was ordered to advance, but only to escort the horse artillery to a point in which they could bring the retreating enemy under artillery fire. The cavalry was specifically told not to attack. Lord Lucan would ignore part of this and take a force of roughly 100 men to round up stragglers of the retreat and take them prisoner. Lord Raglin, seeing the men push forward, issued an order for them to stop. Lucan ignored this, but when the next order came, he was forced to pull back. And to spite Raglin, he ordered all the prisoners to be released. The infantry would laugh at the Light Brigade again as they rode back empty-handed. Lucan was again blamed for humiliating the cavalry in front of the enemy and their own army. The Light Brigade was growing restless with what they saw as inept and unfit commanders. They had missed an opportunity to use the Light Brigade to do what they were made to do to great effect. Captain Nolan was especially critical of the three men. Lord Paget, although not a fan of Cardigan and Lucan, believed it was only Raglin who got it all wrong. They spent the next 2 days at the Alma tending to the wounded and dead before resuming the march south to the third river, the Kacha. While the army set up camp, the Light Brigade was ordered ahead to set up pickets without taking the time to allow the horses to be watered. They reached the final river the next day, the Belbek. By this time, the horses were thirsty and desperate for water. Lord Dipshit Lucan threatened to flog anyone who stopped to water his horse as they crossed the river. The men had a hell of a time with this, as the horses dipped their heads as they crossed, desperate for water. Lord Cardigan would do nothing to enforce this order. He was pissed at Lucan's constant presence. The Heavy Brigade had yet to arrive, so Lucan had nowhere else to be. When Cardigan complained to Raglin of this, he got told to basically shut the fuck up and deal with it. As they marched south, they finally came within sight of Sevastopol, the prize they came to claim. They were close enough to strike, and the men all expected to be in the city within the day. The Russians looked back at them, much expecting the same. Their confidence having been shaken after their defeat at the Alma. Everyone expected to easily overcome the city's defenses. Everyone, that is, except Sir John Burgoyne, the engineering advisor to Lord Raglin, argued that the defenses to the north would be the most prepared for an attack and that going to the south, they would take less casualties there since they wouldn't be as prepared. Nobody agreed with his assessment, although he was able to convince the French commander to agree. And since Raglin was under orders to keep the alliance at all costs, he ended up siding with the French commander. Now, to attack from the south, they would have to march inland, losing the protection of the fleet on their right flank before turning south again to take the small fishing village of Balaclava. This village was 6 miles south of Sevastopol, would be easy to take and serve as a supply base for the attack on the city, as well as providing a safe harbor for the fleet. The downside to this, once they marched inland, they would lose contact with the fleet and have no means of resupply or escape from the Crimea if things went wrong until contact could be reestablished. The march inland involved cutting through a thick forest cut through with narrow tracks. The only map of the area they had showed just one track that would take them all the way through to a road 7 miles northeast of Sevastopol. Lord Cardigan and the Light Brigade would scout ahead and lead the way with an officer from Raglin's staff, Captain Wetherall, going along acting as a pathfinder. Raglin and the artillery would follow at a distance, and the infantry would have to cut straight through the forest on either side of the path and rely mostly on compass bearings. The Light Brigade was to take and occupy the Cooter Mackenzie farm at the road and scout out any enemies in the area before signaling Raglin it was safe to move forward. The Russian commander, Prince Menshikov, chose to not allow his army to get trapped inside the city and marched them out the road to Cooter Mackenzie. Captain Wetherall and the Light Brigade reached an unmarked fork in the road. Captain Wetherall chose the left path, figuring it led to the farm. By the time Raglin and the artillery reached the same fork, the cavalry was already out of sight. They chose the correct path, the one to the right. They were now ahead of the advance guard and marching straight into the enemy. Prince Menshikov had already moved through the area, but stragglers had stopped on the road at the entrance of the forest track to rest and drink. General Airy was riding ahead of the rest and the first to spot the Russians. He quickly stopped and fell back to explain the situation to Raglin, who was pissed. Riders were sent out to find the cavalry and call up the artillery. Fortunately, these Russians weren't exactly the best of the best. They lazily took their time to investigate what they seen, and quickly fled when they saw the British guns. The cavalry was located and led to the farm. They were not allowed to pursue the fleeing soldiers and were verbally reprimanded by Raglin for getting lost. The Light Brigade was humiliated again for having failed one of the most basic tasks of the cavalry, that of an advance guard. They wanted desperately to prove themselves. They would get their chance eventually. However, the terrible lessons being learned would come to haunt them. Lord Lucan was learning that he had no discretion to use his own initiative and must do exactly as Lord Raglin ordered. And Lord Cardigan was being told repeatedly that no matter how ridiculous the order, he must obey his divisional commander. The army turned south at the road and moved as far as the Chernaya River, stopping to camp for the night. In the morning, they would move on Balaclava. The Light Brigade would provide advance and rear guard through the 4-mile march to the small fishing village. As they crossed the open plain between the river and the coast, they had to pass through 2 valleys that ran parallel across the plain. As the advance guard passed into the first valley, they could no longer hear the army marching behind them. They were alone, with only the sound of the horses and men around them. For some of the brigade, this valley would be the last thing they see within the month. Families fled from the small hamlet of Kadikoy near the edge of the plain as the army advanced. Raglin led a small force down a steep track toward Balaclava. The militia, and I use that term loosely, made up of mostly old men, fired a few shots so they could say they resisted before surrendering. The town now belonged to the British without any casualties occurred. The village residents, who had no love for Russia, were allowed to evacuate the village peacefully. The British fleet would use the small harbor to offload all the army's supplies, turning the once small fishing village into a huge supply depot for the invasion to come. The waiting infantry divisions in Kadikoy were ordered back up to the north 4 miles to occupy the hills overlooking Sevastopol. As the infantry set up camp, the defenses were observed. They were confident they could take what little defenses were there with minimal effort and very little worry of being shot at. They fully expected to take the city within a few days. Most British officers and Raglin himself agreed with this assessment. However, dipshit Sir John Burgoyne and the French commander felt otherwise. Instead of attacking immediately, heavy siege guns were to be brought up from Balaclava to bomb the defenses before the infantry would go in. Moving the guns up would take almost 2 weeks to complete. 2 more weeks for the Russians to reinforce their defenses. They were well aware of where the British army was. With this decision made, the infantry would spend its time moving the guns up and digging out proper gun emplacements. Fearing a Russian counterattack, Raglin put a defensive screen on the plains above Balaclava into place. This screen would center around Kadikoy and consist of the Light Brigade, the 93rd Highlanders, and over 2,000 Turkish troops. The Light Brigade set up camp beside Kadikoy as they sent out pickets to watch for the Russians. Other patrols went out to search local farms for additional food for the cavalry and forage for the horses. During the first 4 days of October, the Heavy Brigade arrived. All 5 regiments arrived and set up camp alongside the Light Brigade. With the cavalry division finally complete, they would now share picket and patrol duties. No one knew where the Russian army was, so they had to be continually alert. The Russians began sending out patrols to harass and probe the British defenses. They launched numerous feints to draw the British out. On October 7th, a heavy brigade patrol was confronted by a large Russian force of lancers. They were forced to withdraw. During the withdrawal, 3 men were cut off from the patrol and killed. Lord Lucan, believing an attack was imminent, led the cavalry division out. Captain Nolan, eager for action, joined the cavalry as they moved out. They reached the tops of the hills overlooking the river and found the Russian cavalry waiting for them in the valley below. They waited like an open invitation to attack. Lord Lucan refused to sound the charge his men were so eagerly waiting for. He was following the strict orders that Lord Raglin had issued, that the cavalry was to act defensively and not be drawn into unnecessary engagements. The Light Brigade officers protested, but Lucan held firm and kept the division atop the hills between the Russians and Balaclava. He refused all protest until the horse artillery was brought up, who lobbed fire on the Russians and convinced them to withdraw. Following this incident, Lord Lucan earned himself the nickname Lord Look-On. No idea who started this name, but Captain Nolan was the prime suspect. The infantry so loved the name, they used it for the entirety of the cavalry. The infantry, having already won a major battle and poised to take Sevastopol, saw the cavalry as next to useless at this point. Now, not to be outdone, Lord Cardigan would soon earn his own nickname. While all this was going on, Cardigan was, quote-unquote, sick and had been riding out the illness on a boat in the harbor. The day after he returned from sick leave, his private yacht, the Dryad, arrived in harbor. After spending one night in Kadikoy with his brigade, he announced he had permission to sleep on the Dryad, and of course, enjoy his own private chef and stash of liquor, while his men were forced to sleep on the plains and survived off salted pork and biscuits. Pissed, they started calling him the Noble Yachtsman. This arrangement also pissed off Lucan, who had been living in camp with the regiments and was up before dawn with them. Meanwhile, Cardigan was sleeping and eating on a luxury yacht and couldn't be bothered showing up to the brigade before 10 a.m. Between this and the constant fights between the two, Raglin ordered the Light Brigade camp to be moved for no other reason than to separate the two. Raglin couldn't be bothered to deal with the two. A growing sense of fear that a Russian attack was bound to come was building. To bolster the defensive line, a series of redoubts was ordered to be built on the high ground between the two valleys. 4 of these were built with a spacing of 500 yards between them. These redoubts were little dugout forts made from dirt, each containing 2 or 3 12-pounder guns and anywhere from 200 to 600 Turkish infantrymen in each. They wouldn't stop an army, but they would delay them. These redoubts would be called the Causeway Heights, and they would be the first line of defense. A second line, made up of the 93rd Highlanders and the rest of the Turks, was set up behind them. The cavalry and horse artillery would be used as a mobile defense force to reinforce either line if the need should arrive. Lucan was humiliated again when he was stripped of overall command of the defense. While he would retain command of the cavalry, Sir Colin Campbell, the commanding officer of the 93rd Highlanders, would be placed in charge of the overall defense. And with the defenses of Balaclava in place, that is where we are going to stop for this episode. Next week, we'll pick back up with the siege of Sevastopol and the further events leading to the charge of the Light Brigade. Thanks for listening, and if you like the show, please consider leaving a rating or review. And as always, you can reach out to the show at historiesadisaster@gmail.com or on social media. Those links are in the show notes. Or share the episode, because sharing is caring. And if there was more caring in the world, maybe history wouldn't be a disaster. Thanks and goodbye.